I was about to call security to have the street child removed from my building when he said something that made my blood freeze. "Find the music box with the dancing bear." Those were the exact words my husband Richard had whispered to me 3 months ago on his deathbed. The exact words. No one else had been in the room except a nurse who wasn't paying attention and me and Richard with his final breath escaping like air from a punctured tire. Now this boy, this dirty child with holes in his shoes who had somehow gotten past building security and into the marble lobby of the Meridian Tower where I lived in a penthouse and where children like him definitely did not belong, was standing in front of me repeating the last coherent thing my dying husband had said. I had been reaching for my phone to call security because that's what you do when street children appear in expensive buildings, but now my hand was frozen halfway to the security button and I couldn't move and I couldn't breathe and I couldn't understand how this was happening. But those words, those impossible words that no one else knew except Richard and me and the nurse who had been adjusting his floor when he said them and who probably hadn't been listening anyway because nurses hear dying people say strange things all the time and they learn not to catalog the final nonsense that spills from lips that are already halfway to silence. The boy stood there looking at me with eyes that were too old for his face and too knowing for someone who couldn't have been more than 10 years old and who should have been in school instead of standing in my lobby saying things that made my chest tight and my breathing shallow and my hand shake as it hovered over the phone that would summon men in uniforms who would take him away and ask questions later. "What did you say?" I whispered, and my voice sounded like it was coming from someone else's throat because my throat had closed up the way it does when you're about to cry in public and you're trying not to, because crying in public is something that Victoria Hartwell does not do and has never done, even when Richard was dying and even when the funeral director was explaining options for caskets as if we were discussing vacation destinations instead of boxes that would hold what was left of 37 years of marriage. The boy took a step closer and I noticed that his clothes were clean even though they were old and patched, and that someone had tried to comb his hair even though it was still sticking up in places, and that his shoes might have been held together with tape but they were tied properly and someone had taught him to tie them properly, and someone had cared enough to make sure he looked presentable, even if presentable for him meant something different than presentable for the people who lived in towers like this one. "The music box with the dancing bear," he said again, and this time his voice was steadier and I could hear that he was trying to be brave even though his hands were shaking and even though he kept glancing toward the door as if he was ready to run if I decided to call security after all. I sat down heavily in one of the leather chairs that the building management had placed in the lobby for decoration more than comfort, because no one who lived here ever sat in the lobby and waited for anything, because people like us didn't wait in lobbies. We waited in our apartments or our cars or our offices, but never in public spaces where other people might see us being anything other than perpetually in motion and perpetually important. "How do you know about the music box?" I asked, and the question came out as a whisper because speaking louder would have meant admitting that this was really happening and that a street child somehow knew about something that existed in the private mythology of my marriage and that Richard had mentioned exactly once in 37 years, and only on the day he died, and only when the morphine was making him say things that didn't make sense, except now they did make sense, or at least they made enough sense to stop me from calling security. The boy looked around the lobby as if he was memorizing it or as if he was checking to make sure no one else was listening, and then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and silver, and when he held it up to the light I could see that it was a key, and not just any key but the kind of key that opens music boxes and jewelry boxes, and small precious things that people keep locked away. "He gave this to me," the boy said, and his voice was so quiet that I had to lean forward to hear him, and when I leaned forward I could smell the city on him. Car exhaust and rain and something else that might have been fear or might have been hope, because sometimes they smell the same, especially on children who have learned to carry both simultaneously. "He? Who is he?" I asked, even though I already knew or thought I knew, but knowing and being certain are different things, and I needed to be certain because if I was wrong then I was sitting in my lobby having a conversation with a child who might be dangerous or might be lying or might be both, and if I was right then everything I thought I knew about the last 3 months of my life was about to change. "The man in the hospital," the boy said, and he was looking at me with those two old eyes, and I could see that he was trying to decide whether to trust me or run, and I wanted to tell him that I was trying to make the same decision, but instead I just sat there and waited, because waiting was something I had learned to do during those long weeks when Richard was dying and the doctors were explaining procedures and the nurses were adjusting medications and everyone was doing things that were supposed to help but really just prolonged the inevitable. "What man in the hospital?" I asked, because I needed him to say it. I needed him to say Richard's name, or at least describe him in a way that would make it impossible for this to be a coincidence or a con or one of those elaborate schemes that people create to take advantage of grieving widows who live in expensive towers and who might be desperate. enough to believe anything that connects them to their dead husbands. The boy shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and I could see that his shoes were not just held together with tape but that they were too small for his feet, and that someone had tried to stretch them or make them work anyway, and that he was the kind of child who was used to making things work anyway and who had probably been making things work anyway for most of his short life. The man with the gray hair who was always reading the newspaper even though his hands shook when he tried to turn the pages. The boy said, and my breath caught because Richard had always read the newspaper and had always been particular about reading the physical newspaper, not the digital version, and had continued reading it even when the shaking started and even when he needed help turning the pages and even when the doctor said that reading might be too much stimulation, but he had insisted because the newspaper was part of his morning routine and Richard had been a man of routines. The man who had a wedding ring that was too big for his finger because he got thin but he wouldn't take it off, the boy continued, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach because Richard had lost 40 pounds in the last 6 months and his wedding ring had become loose and the nurses had suggested that we have it resized or that he keep it in a safe place, but he had refused and had continued wearing it even though it slipped and turned on his finger and even though he was always touching it and spinning it when he was nervous or uncomfortable. The man who called someone Victoria and who said he missed the way she hummed when she was cooking dinner, the boy said, and that cold thing in my stomach turned into something sharp and painful because I did hum when I cooked and Richard had always teased me about it and had said that I hummed different songs depending on what I was making and that he could tell what dinner would be just by listening to the melody that floated from the kitchen to wherever he was reading his newspaper. I stood up from the chair and walked to the window that looked out onto the street where normal people were doing normal things like walking dogs and waiting for buses and carrying groceries and living lives that didn't include mysterious children who appeared in lobbies with keys to music boxes that might or might not exist and who knew impossible things about dead husbands and humming wives. "Where did you meet him?" I asked without turning around because I needed to look at something other than the boy's face while I tried to process what was happening and whether I was losing my mind or whether the world had suddenly become a place where strange things happened to people like me who had always lived orderly lives in orderly apartments with orderly routines that did not include magic or mystery or children who appeared like messengers from some other realm. "He was in the children's ward," the boy said, and his voice was closer now, and when I turned around I could see that he had followed me to the window and was standing next to me looking out at the street as if he was trying to memorize this view or as if he was trying to figure out how to explain something that didn't make sense even to him. "The children's ward," I repeated, and I felt confused because Richard had been in the oncology ward and then in hospice and I had never heard anyone mention a children's ward, and I had spent months navigating the maze of that hospital and learning the names of nurses and the schedules of doctors and the locations of vending machines and waiting rooms and quiet places where you could cry without anyone noticing. "I was there for a long time," the boy said, and something in his voice told me that a long time meant something different to him than it meant to me, and that his long time had probably been measured in ways that children shouldn't have to measure time, like treatments and tests and nights spent in beds that weren't their own, surrounded by sounds that weren't the sounds of home. "He used to come and visit the children's ward even though he was a patient in a different part of the hospital," the boy continued, and he was still looking out the window, but I could see his reflection in the glass and I could see that he was trying not to cry and that he was the kind of child who had learned not to cry in front of adults because crying had probably been something that made adults uncomfortable or impatient or both. He would bring books and read to us, and sometimes he would just sit with the kids who were too sick to listen to stories, and he would tell them about his wife who hummed when she cooked and who made the best chocolate chip cookies even though she always burned the edges a little bit, and who had a music box with a dancing bear that played a song his mother used to sing to him when he was our age. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window and closed my eyes because this was impossible, and this was exactly the kind of thing that Richard would have done and that he would have done secretly without telling me, because he knew that I would have worried about him overexerting himself or catching something from the children or using energy that he needed for his own recovery, even though we both knew that there wasn't going to be any recovery and that energy was something that was running out like sand through an hourglass. He told me that if anything happened to him I should find you and give you this key and tell you about the music box, because he said there was something inside it that you needed to have and that he had been trying to figure out how to give it to you, but he couldn't find the right words and he was running out of time to find the right words. The boy held out the key and I could see that it was old and silver and that it had been polished recently and that someone had cared enough to make sure it was clean and shiny before bringing it to me, and that someone was probably this child who had taken on the responsibility of delivering a message from a dying man to his wife and who had somehow found me in a city of millions of people and who had somehow made it past building security and into my lobby, where he was now standing with a key that might unlock something that would change everything or nothing or something in between. I took the key and it was warm from his hand and heavier than I had expected, and when I held it up to the light I could see that there were tiny engravings on it, flowers or leaves or something delicate that someone had taken time to create, and that suggested that this key was meant for something special and something worth locking away. "What's your name?" I asked, because I realized that I was holding a key that my dead husband had given to a child whose name I didn't know and who might disappear from my life as suddenly as he had appeared, and who might be the only person who could help me understand what Richard had been trying to tell me in those final confused moments when the morphine was making him say things that sounded like nonsense but apparently weren't nonsense at all. "Danny," he said, and it was the first time he had smiled since he had been standing in my lobby, and the smile made him look like the child he was instead of the old soul he had been forced to become, and it made me want to ask him about his family and his home and how a 10-year-old ends up in a children's ward making friends with dying men who give him keys to music boxes that they can't find words to explain to their wives. "Danny," I repeated, and the name felt familiar in my mouth as if Richard had mentioned it, even though I couldn't remember him ever talking about meeting children in the hospital, and I couldn't remember him ever talking about visiting other parts of the hospital, and I couldn't remember him ever talking about anything other than how tired he was and how much he missed being home and how much he missed the way things used to be when he was healthy and when we were planning a future that now would never happen. "He said you would know where to find the music box," Danny said, and he was looking at me with expectation and trust and the kind of faith that children have in adults, even when adults have repeatedly demonstrated that they are not worthy of such faith and that they are just as lost and confused and frightened as everyone else but are better at hiding it behind expensive clothes and controlled expressions and voices that sound calm even when everything inside is screaming. But I didn't know where to find the music box, and I had never heard of a music box with a dancing bear, and I had never heard Richard's mother sing to him, and I had never heard the song that the music box supposedly played, and I was beginning to think that this was all some elaborate mistake or cruel joke or manifestation of grief that had finally driven me to the point where I was seeing things and hearing things and believing things that couldn't possibly be true. "I don't know about any music box," I said, and my voice sounded defeated even to my own ears, and I could see Danny's face change and his shoulders slump as if he had been carrying the weight of this mission for a long time and had been hoping that delivering the key would be the end of his responsibility and the completion of a promise made to a dying man who had trusted him with something important. "He said you would know," Danny said again, but this time his voice was smaller and more uncertain, and I could see that he was trying to figure out what to do next and whether he had failed in his mission or whether I was failing him or whether we were all failing each other in ways that couldn't be fixed with keys or explanations or good intentions. I looked at the key in my hand and tried to think of every music box I had ever seen and every bear I had ever encountered and every song that might have been sung by Richard's mother, who had died when he was 16 and who had left behind very few possessions and very few stories and very few clues about the kind of mother she had been or the kind of songs she might have sung to her son. And then I remembered the storage unit. The storage unit that Richard had rented after his mother died and that he had filled with her belongings and that he had visited occasionally over the years but that he had never invited me to see, and that he had always said contained just old furniture and photo albums and things that weren't worth keeping but that he couldn't bring himself to throw away, and that would eventually need to be sorted through, but not yet and not today and not until he was ready, which apparently he never was. "I might know where it is," I said, and Danny's face brightened and I could see hope replacing uncertainty, and I could see that he was still young enough to believe that problems could be solved and that promises could be kept and that people could find what they were looking for if they just looked hard enough and in the right places. "Will you take me there?" Danny asked, and the question caught me off guard because I had been thinking about going to the storage unit alone and about finding the music box alone and about discovering whatever Richard had wanted me to discover alone, because dealing with grief and mystery and impossible revelations was something that seemed like it should be done in private and in silence and without witnesses who might judge or question or try to help in ways that weren't actually helpful. But looking at Danny's face and remembering that he had been the one to bring me the key and that he had been the one to carry Richard's message and that he had been the one to risk coming to my building and facing security and facing me and facing the possibility that I might not believe him or might not care or might not be the kind of person who would honor a dying man's last request, I realized that he had as much right to see this through as I did, and maybe more right, because he had been the one who had sat with Richard in his final days and had listened to his stories and had accepted the responsibility of being his messenger. "Yes," I said, and the word surprised me because I hadn't planned to say it and I hadn't planned to include a 10-year-old boy in whatever journey this was going to be, and I hadn't planned to trust a stranger with something that felt sacred and private and potentially devastating, but sometimes the most important decisions are the ones that make themselves and that bypass the careful deliberation that usually governs the choices of people who live in towers and who have learned to be cautious about everything, especially about hope. Danny smiled again, and this time the smile was bigger and more genuine, and I could see that he was relieved and excited and probably a little scared about what we might find and what it might mean and how it might change things or not change things or change things in ways that we couldn't predict or control or understand. "When can we go?" he asked, and I looked at the key in my hand and thought about the storage unit that I had never visited and the music box that I had never seen and the song that I had never heard and the message that Richard had been trying to send me through a child who had become his final link to the world of the living and his final gift to the wife he was leaving behind. "Now," I said, because waiting had become something I was tired of doing, and because some things couldn't be postponed, and because sometimes the only way to find out what you're afraid of discovering is to stop being afraid and start moving and trust that whatever you find will be something you can survive even if it's not something you can understand. And so we left the lobby together, the grieving widow and the street child with the key to a music box that might or might not exist and that might or might not contain the answer to a question that I hadn't even known I was supposed to be asking, and that might or might not be the final chapter in a love story that had lasted 37 years and that I had thought was over, but that apparently was still being written in ways that I could never have imagined and in places that I had never thought to look and through people that I had never expected to meet and who had never expected to meet me, but who had somehow become essential to understanding what Richard had been trying to tell me when he whispered about dancing bears and music boxes and the kinds of treasures that people keep locked away until they're ready to share them or until they're running out of time to keep them secret. The storage unit smelled like dust and forgotten time, and when I turned on the single bulb that dangled from the ceiling, Danny's eyes went wide because neither of us had expected to find what we found there. It wasn't just furniture and photo albums like Richard had always said. The small concrete room was filled with children's toys, hundreds of them arranged on shelves that Richard had built himself and organized with the same careful attention he had given to everything else in his life. There were teddy bears and wooden trains and dolls with porcelain faces and music boxes and jack-in-the-boxes and every kind of toy that a child might love and that someone had clearly loved very much because each one had been dusted and polished and placed with care. "He collected toys," Danny whispered, and his voice echoed in the small space, and I could hear wonder in it and something else that might have been recognition, because some of these toys looked familiar to him and some of them looked like things he had seen before but couldn't quite place. I walked deeper into the storage unit, running my fingers along the shelves and trying to understand why Richard had been keeping this secret for all these years and why he had never told me about the toys and why he had let me believe that this space contained nothing but old furniture and memories that were too painful to revisit. "Look," Danny said, and he was pointing to a corner where there was a small desk, and on the desk was a photo album, and next to the photo album was a music box, and even from across the room I could see that the music box had a dancing bear on top of it and that the bear was wearing a tiny red vest and that its arms were positioned as if it was mid-dance and waiting for the music to begin. I walked to the desk and picked up the music box, and it was heavier than I had expected and more beautiful than I had imagined, and when I turned it over I could see the keyhole, and I could see that it was the exact size and shape of the key that Danny had given me and that Richard had given to him and that someone had kept safe for 3 months, while waiting for this moment. "Open it," Danny said, and he was standing next to me now, and I could smell the city on him, and I could feel his excitement and his nervousness and his hope that whatever was inside this music box would be worth the journey that had brought us here and the trust that had been placed in both of us. I inserted the key and turned it, and the music box opened with a soft click and immediately began to play a melody that was sweet and simple and somehow familiar, even though I was certain I had never heard it before, and the bear began to dance in slow circles while the music played and while Danny and I stood there listening to a song that connected us to Richard and to something larger than both of us. Inside the music box was a small velvet compartment, and inside the compartment was a letter folded so many times that it was no bigger than a matchbook, and when I unfolded it I could see that it was written in Richard's handwriting, but not the shaky handwriting of his final months, but the strong clear handwriting of the man I had married and a man who had been healthy and full of plans and dreams that he had never shared with me. "My dearest Victoria," the letter began, and I had to sit down in the small chair that was positioned in front of the desk because my legs weren't strong enough to hold me up while I read words that my husband had written to me but had never given me and that had been waiting in this storage unit for reasons that I couldn't begin to understand. "If you are reading this, then Danny has found you and has brought you here and has fulfilled the promise that he made to me during those long nights when we talked about things that matter and things that don't and things that fall somewhere in between. I hope you will forgive me for keeping this secret, but some secrets are meant to be kept until the right moment, and the right moment is now, when you are ready to understand what I have been trying to tell you for 37 years but never found the courage to say directly. I looked at Danny and he was examining the toys on the shelves and running his fingers along the wooden trains and the stuffed animals, and I could see that he was trying to give me privacy to read, but that he was also curious about what the letter said and what it might mean and how it might change things or not change things or change things in ways that none of us could predict. These toys belong to our son, the letter continued, and I felt the world tilt because we had never had a son and we had never had any children, and we had tried for years and had been to doctors and had been through treatments and had eventually accepted that children were not going to be part of our story and had built a different kind of life together and had been happy with that life, or at least I had thought we had been happy with that life. His name was Michael and he lived for 3 days and you never knew about him because you were unconscious after the emergency surgery, and the doctors said that telling you about him would only cause more pain, and I was young and scared and I listened to them and I let them take him away and I let them tell you that there had been complications, but that everything was going to be fine and that we could try again someday when you were stronger. I remembered the surgery and I remembered waking up in the hospital and I remembered feeling empty and hollow and wrong in ways that I couldn't explain, and I remembered asking Richard what had happened, and I remembered him holding my hand and telling me that there had been complications but that I was going to be fine and that we would get through this together and that we had each other, and that was enough. But it wasn't enough for me. The letter continued and I could hear Richard's voice in the words and I could feel his guilt and his grief and his love and his regret and all the things that he had been carrying for 37 years without telling me and without sharing the weight of it and without letting me help him carry it or help him heal from it. I couldn't stop thinking about him and I couldn't stop wondering what he would have been like and what toys he would have loved and what songs would have made him laugh and what stories would have helped him fall asleep. So I started collecting toys and I started buying the things that I thought he would have wanted, and I started building a room for him even though he wasn't there to play in it, and even though it was probably crazy, and even though I knew that you would think it was crazy if you ever found out. Danny had stopped examining the toys and was listening to me read, and I could see that he was trying to understand what this meant and how it connected to him and to Richard and to the promise that he had made to a dying man who had trusted him with something precious and fragile and important. Every year on his birthday I would come here and I would add something new to the collection, and I would wind up the music box and I would listen to the song that my mother used to sing to me when I was small, and I would pretend that he was there with me and that he was growing up and that he was happy and that he knew that his father loved him, even though his father had failed him in the most important way that a father can fail a child. I was crying now and the tears were falling on the letter and blurring the ink, but I kept reading because I needed to know everything and I needed to understand why Richard had kept this secret and why he had never told me about our son and why he had never let me grieve with him and why he had carried this alone for so many years. I know that you will be angry with me for keeping this from you, and I know that you will feel betrayed and hurt and confused, and you have every right to feel those things because I should have told you and I should have let you decide for yourself whether you wanted to know about him and whether you wanted to grieve for him and whether you wanted to build a shrine to him or just try to forget that he ever existed. Danny walked over to me and put his small hand on my shoulder, and I could feel the warmth of his palm through my shirt, and I could feel his concern and his compassion and his desire to comfort me, even though he was just a child and even though he had his own pain and his own struggles and his own reasons for being in a children's ward and for befriending dying men who gave him keys to music boxes. But I want you to know that not a day went by that I didn't think about telling you, and not a day went by that I didn't miss him, and not a day went by that I didn't wonder what our lives would have been like if he had lived, and if we had been able to raise him together, and if we had been able to give him all the love that we had been saving up for the children we never had. I looked around the storage unit and saw it differently now, and saw that it wasn't just a collection of toys but a memorial and a museum and a father's love letter to a son who had never had the chance to play with any of these things and who had never had the chance to know that his father had been thinking about him and missing him and loving him for 37 years. The reason I am telling you this now is because I met someone in the hospital who reminded me of what Michael might have been like if he had lived and if he had grown up and if he had been the kind of brave and caring and wise child that I always imagined he would be. This boy's name is Danny, and he has been through more in his 10 years than most people go through in a lifetime, and he has a strength and a gentleness that I think Michael would have had and that I think you would love if you gave yourself the chance to know him. I looked at Danny and he was looking back at me with those old eyes that had seen too much and that had learned to be cautious about trusting adults and that had learned to be independent and self-reliant and strong in ways that children shouldn't have to be strong, and I could see Richard in him somehow, and I could see what Richard had seen and why he had connected with this boy and why he had trusted him with something so precious and so private. Danny's parents died in a car accident 2 years ago, and he has been living with his grandmother who is sick and who can't take care of him the way he needs to be taken care of, and who is probably going to die soon and leave him alone in the world. He has been in and out of the hospital for the past few months because he has been trying to take care of his grandmother and because he has been trying to take care of himself and because he has been trying to be strong for both of them even though he is still just a child and even though he shouldn't have to be strong for anyone. I felt something shift in my chest and I felt something open up that had been closed for a long time and I felt something that might have been hope or might have been purpose or might have been the beginning of understanding what Richard had been trying to tell me and what he had been trying to give me and what he had been trying to ask me to do. I know that this is a lot to ask and I know that you never wanted children and I know that you have built a life that doesn't include children and that you might not want to change that life or disrupt that life or complicate that life with the needs and demands and chaos that come with taking care of a child. But I also know that you have more love in your heart than you know what to do with and that you have been looking for ways to honor my memory and to make sense of your grief and to find meaning in the time that you have left. Danny was crying now too and I could see that he was trying not to let me see him cry but that he was overwhelmed by what he was hearing and by what it might mean and by the possibility that maybe he wouldn't be alone in the world and maybe someone would want to take care of him and maybe someone would love him the way that parents are supposed to love their children and the way that his parents had loved him before they died and left him to figure out how to survive on his own. I am not asking you to replace Michael with Danny and I am not asking you to pretend that Danny is the son we never got to raise. I am asking you to consider that maybe the universe has a sense of humor and maybe the universe has a plan and maybe the universe has brought the two of you together for reasons that we can't understand but that we can trust and that we can embrace if we are brave enough to try. I folded the letter and put it back in the music box and closed the lid and the bear stopped dancing and the music stopped playing and the storage unit was quiet except for the sound of Danny's breathing and my breathing and the distant hum of traffic outside and the sound of two people who had found each other in the most unexpected way and who were trying to figure out what to do next. Danny, I said and my voice was soft and careful because I didn't want to scare him and I didn't want to make promises that I couldn't keep and I didn't want to raise hopes that might be crushed if I changed my mind or if I decided that this was too much or too complicated or too frightening to take on. Yes ma'am, he said and he was wiping his eyes with the back of his hand and trying to compose himself and trying to be strong the way that he had learned to be strong and the way that he thought adults expected him to be. How would you feel about coming home with me? I asked and the question surprised me because I hadn't planned to ask it and I hadn't thought about what it would mean or what it would involve or whether I was ready for the responsibility of taking care of a child who had been through trauma and who had needs that I didn't understand and who might not want to be taken care of by a stranger who lived in a tower and who knew nothing about children or about parenting or about love that wasn't conditional on good behavior and clean clothes and proper grammar. Danny looked at me with those old eyes and I could see that he was trying to decide whether to trust me or whether to protect himself from disappointment or whether to believe that maybe this was the answer to prayers that he had been afraid to pray and hopes that he had been afraid to hope. Do you mean it? He asked and his voice was small and uncertain and full of the kind of longing that children shouldn't have to feel and the kind of desperation that comes from being alone in the world and from knowing that you are running out of people who might care about you and running out of chances to find a place where you belong. I mean it, I said and I did mean it even though I was terrified and even though I had no idea what I was doing and even though this was the most impulsive and irrational and potentially disastrous decision I had ever made and even though Richard wasn't there to help me and even though I would be figuring this out as I went along and making mistakes and learning from them and hoping that love would be enough to bridge the gap between what Danny needed and what I knew how to give. But I have to tell you something first, Danny said and his voice was serious and he was looking at me with an expression that was older than his years and that suggested that he had learned to be careful about secrets and about trust and about the things that people keep hidden from each other. What is it? I asked and I was prepared for him to tell me that he was sick or that he was in trouble or that he had lied about something or that there was some reason why this wouldn't work or why I shouldn't take him home with me or why this was all too good to be true. I'm not really 10 years old, Danny said and he was looking at the floor and I could see that he was ashamed or embarrassed or afraid of how I would react to this confession and what it might mean for the fragile trust that we had been building and the tentative hope that we had been sharing. How old are you? I asked and I was trying to keep my voice calm and neutral because I could see that this was difficult for him and that he was taking a risk by telling me the truth and that he was probably expecting me to be angry or disappointed or to change my mind about taking him home with me. I'm 12, he said and he looked up at me to see how I would react and I could see that he was bracing himself for rejection or anger or the kind of adult disappointment that he had probably experienced before when he had been caught in lies or when he had been forced to admit that he wasn't who he had pretended to be. Why did you tell me you were 10? I asked and I was genuinely curious because the difference between 10 and 12 seemed significant in some ways and insignificant in others and because I wanted to understand why he had felt the need to lie and what he had been hoping to accomplish by making himself seem younger than he was. Because 10-year-olds get adopted more than 12-year-olds, Danny said, and his voice was matter-of-fact and practical and heartbreaking because it suggested that he had been thinking about adoption and about finding a family and about the statistics and probabilities and market forces that determined which children got chosen and which children got left behind and which children aged out of the system and into lives that were much harder than the lives of children who had families to take care of them. "I don't care how old you are," I said, and I meant it because age was just a number, and because Danny was Danny regardless of whether he was 10 or 12 or 15 or 20, and because the connection that I felt to him wasn't based on his age or his size or his perceived innocence but on something deeper and more essential and more permanent than any of those things. "Really?" he asked, and I could hear hope in his voice, and I could see that he was allowing himself to believe that maybe this was really happening, and maybe he was really going to have a home, and maybe he was really going to have someone who cared about him and who would take care of him and who would love him the way that parents are supposed to love their children. "Really?" I said, and I reached out and took his hand, and his fingers were small and warm and slightly sticky and completely real and completely mine now and completely my responsibility and completely my gift from Richard and from Michael and from the universe that had brought us together in the most unlikely way and at the most perfect time. "But there's one more thing," Danny said, and he was smiling now, but there was still something cautious in his expression and something that suggested that he had one more secret or one more confession or one more thing that he needed to tell me before we could truly trust each other and before we could truly begin this new chapter of our lives together. "What is it?" I asked, and I was prepared for anything now because I had learned that life was full of surprises and that the most important things were often the things that you never saw coming and that the most beautiful moments were often the ones that emerged from the most unexpected circumstances. "I already knew about the music box," Danny said, and he was grinning now, and I could see mischief in his eyes, and I could see that he was enjoying the surprise and the confusion on my face and the way that this revelation changed everything that I thought I knew about how we had ended up here and how this had all begun. "What do you mean?" I asked, and I felt like I was missing something important and like there was a piece of this puzzle that I hadn't found yet, and like Danny was about to tell me something that would make me understand this whole strange and wonderful and impossible day in a completely different way. "He gave me the key 3 months ago," Danny said, and he was laughing now, and I could see that he was relieved to finally tell me the truth and to finally share the secret that he had been carrying and to finally reveal the extent of his role in Richard's plan and the depth of his connection to both of us. "But he also gave me your address and told me to wait 3 months before I came to find you because he said that 3 months was how long it would take for you to be ready to hear what he had to tell you and to understand what he wanted to give you and to accept what he was asking you to do." I stared at Danny and felt my understanding of the past 3 months shift and rearrange itself, and I realized that Richard had been orchestrating this meeting and planning this moment and preparing this gift for me even while he was dying and even while he was saying goodbye and even while he was pretending that he was just talking nonsense about music boxes and dancing bears. "He planned all of this?" I asked, and I was amazed and grateful and slightly annoyed that Richard had been manipulating events from beyond the grave and that he had been pulling strings and arranging meetings and managing my grief and my healing and my future in ways that I hadn't consented to and that I hadn't been aware of and that I couldn't control or predict or understand. "He said that you would need time to miss him and time to be angry and time to be sad and time to be ready for something new and something different and something that would give your life meaning and purpose and love again," Danny said, and he was serious now, and I could see that he was repeating words that Richard had said to him and that he had been carrying Richard's message and Richard's hope and Richard's love for me for 3 months while he waited for the right moment to deliver it. "And he said that I would need time to get used to the idea of having a new family and time to grieve for my grandmother who died last month and time to be ready to trust someone new and to love someone new and to let someone take care of me the way that I had been taking care of everyone else." I felt tears coming again, but this time they were different tears, and they were tears of gratitude and amazement and love for Richard, who had known me better than I had known myself and who had understood what I would need and when I would need it and who had arranged for me to receive the greatest gift of my life exactly when I was ready to receive it and exactly in the way that I would be able to accept it. "So what do you think?" Danny asked, and he was still holding my hand, and I could feel his pulse and his warmth and his life and his hope and his trust and his willingness to bet his future on the possibility that I would be the kind of mother that he needed and the kind of person that Richard had believed I could be. "I think," I said, and I was looking around the storage unit at all the toys that Richard had collected for our son and that were now going to belong to this son and that were going to finally be played with and loved and appreciated the way that they had been meant to be loved and appreciated. "I think we should take some of these toys home with us and figure out how to put them in your room." "My room?" Danny asked, and his voice was full of wonder and disbelief and the kind of joy that comes from discovering that the thing you wanted most in the world was actually possible and actually happening and actually yours. Your room, I said, and I meant it, and I could already picture it, and I could already see Danny playing with the trains and reading the books and sleeping in a bed that was his and waking up in a house where he belonged and where he was wanted and where he was loved without conditions or expectations or the fear that it might all disappear if he wasn't perfect or if he made mistakes or if he needed too much or asked for too much or hoped for too much. Thank you, Danny said, and he was crying again, but this time his tears were happy tears and I was crying too, but my tears were also happy tears, and we were both crying and laughing and holding hands in a storage unit full of toys and memories and love and hope and the kind of magic that happens when the universe decides to give you exactly what you need exactly when you need it in exactly the way that you never would have thought to ask for it, but that turns out to be exactly right. And that's how Richard gave me our son after all. Not the son we had lost and not the son we had grieved for and not the son we had never gotten to raise, but the son we were meant to have and the son who was meant to have us and the son who would help us both heal and grow and learn and love in ways that we never could have imagined, but that felt as natural and as right and as inevitable as breathing.